We'll get started. I'm sure there'll be lots of people joining us over the next minute or so, but we'll kick off. Let me start by acknowledging the First Nations peoples on whose lands we're meeting all across the country. I'm here on Ngunnawal and Ngambria land, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Fran Baum. I'm quite sure nobody will need an introduction to Fran, but I am going to give you some of her highlights because I think it really, really warrants it. Fran's NHMRC Leadership Fellow, a new major award this year. She's been a distinguished professor at Flinders University for many years. She received an Officer of the Order of Australia. I'm looking at the bio to see when that was. I can't quite remember. That was just a few years ago. Really for all of her services to bring this attention and action on public health and health inequities in particular. And very importantly, and some of the work that Fran's going to speak about now is being the co-chair of the People's Health Movement, the Global Steering Council. And Fran really is one of the world's most eminent critical public health scholars, absolutely. And she is this lovely combination of both a scholar and an academic activist. And I think she lives and breathes being an academic activist in ways that we can all learn, and we're going to hear from her now for exactly those sorts of things. I'm Sharon Friel. I'm the Director of the Menzies Centre at the School of Regulation and Global Governance here at the ANU. We've been running these webinars throughout November, focusing on power and the people's health. We've heard about sort of power generally. Last week we heard about corporate power, and now Fran is going to give us an insight into really the release of people's power. So Fran, my huge pleasure to hand over to you.
There we go. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. So thanks, Sharon. It's really good to be here, and I see lots of familiar names in the participant list, so welcome everybody. And yes, I'm going to talk to you about thinking about what's the kind of theory of action that underpins civil society. And I will focus on the People's Health Movement, but I'm also going to look a bit more broadly. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded traditional lands of the Kaurna people, who are the people of the Adelaide Hills and Plains, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, and acknowledge their resilience through the processes of colonisation. And I'll say Nina Mani, which is hello in Ghana. I'm afraid that's the only words I know. So what I'm going to do, and I hope to speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then I hope we can have some discussion, is to look at the importance of civil society to policies for health equity and just summarise some of the work you remember that Sharon spoke to in the first seminar in this series when she looked particularly at power. So I just want to look at the idea of political will and civil society and just very quickly summarise what we found from our Centre for Research Excellence in Health Equity. And then I will look at the People's Health Movement and our theory of change, and also think about how can you research civil society activism, because it's always fast moving and it's not easy, and also understanding those pathways to activism, how people exert their agency in the face of structural power, what our theories of change are, and the importance of a convergence between social movements. So that's an overview of where we're going. So this slide, I think Sharon showed on her presentation, where and here I've just added how civil society fits in. So in this program of work, we looked at the why, how we describe the program, and of course civil society plays a big role in agenda setting. Then we looked at policy prescriptions, and we've considered the role of civil society in good governance. And finally, looking at the how things happen, looking at civil society actors, what their roles is, and what ideas they may bring to policy. So always, whatever issue you look at in public health, civil society is there somewhere, I think. And our CRE really tried to look at the whole policy cycle, and civil society was embedded through whichever policy area we looked at. And here you can see the 8 areas that we looked at. We were able to document the role, either the absence of civil society if there was, but also when civil society was playing a crucial role. The case studies we looked at were a trade agreement, the NBN, paid parental leave, the Northern Territory emergency response, which happened under Howard, of course, the Western Sydney City deal, primary healthcare policy federally, closing the gap, and the closure of the Holden factory in Playford in South Australia. And if we look, we kind of looked at the question of how do you get political will for social determinants of health? And we really looked at civil society's role in creating that political will. And there are the 8 case studies. The only one where we felt health equity was an important part of the policy was in terms of paid parental leave. And we were able to show, particularly Belle Townsend's work, about the crucial influence of the women's advocates and how much they, when there was a window of opportunity, they were there ready to argue for the case for paid parental leave. In the Western Sydney City deal, and I think Patrick Harris is online and Patrick led this work, we really documented limited civil society involvement. There wasn't a strong voice for getting health or broader sort of well-being issues on the agenda. In primary healthcare, we found a very weak lobby for comprehensive primary healthcare, except for the Aboriginal community-controlled sector, which was also vital in closing the gap, where there was a very strong and well-organised advocacy from many groups that really understood evidence on social determinants and really got the legacy of colonialism. So that was a really strong role. In terms of the trade agreement, the advocates were vocal and they only had small wins on issues such as being able to govern tobacco, basically, and the access to medicines, ensuring that was protected. In the NBN, there was a consumer and community advocacy on inclusion, particularly in regards to rural and remote issues and the affordability of network services, but it really had little effect on policy implementation as we moved from a sort of fast broadband to a copper wire broadband. So that really was not very good for equity. In the Holden closure, really, there was the trade union for workers only, but not much of an advocacy for the broader society. And in the Northern Territory emergency response, there was strong advocacy, but it was largely ignored, although there were a few positive impacts, such as constraining the government in terms of the mandatory child checks, health checks for children. So what we really learned from that was that advocates have a big role in bringing about health equity policy. It led to bipartisan political support, I think, for closing the gap because there'd been such a strong civil society. Paid parental leave was rewarded after about 3 decades of lobbying by women's groups. The union was influential for the Holden workers, particularly in them trying to find employment after the factory closed. And at least the voice of civil society meant that trade negotiators were aware of health concerns. So that was an important win. And I always come back to this cartoon, which I worked on with Simon Kneebone, who's a fantastic South Australian-based cartoonist, and just saying that if we're going to crack the nut of health inequity, then you actually do need the bottom-up pressure as well as the downward pressure from senior policymakers and politicians. There's no doubt about that. Now, Sharon said in the introduction that, yes, I'm an activist academic, and I don't think I could be an academic unless I was also an activist. They go together for me. And the quote, this research I'm talking about was funded by a Canadian body, IDRC, and we were funded to examine civil society activism through the activities of the People's Health Movement. And that's the quote that we put in the front of our report. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So that's crucial for us. Our research team was led by Chiara Bodini, who's a PHA member from Italy, David Sanders from South Africa, who sadly died some 2 years ago, Ron Labonte from Canada, David Legg, a colleague in the People's Health Movement in Australia, and myself. And also we had research activist teams in 6 countries. And each of those teams had a sort of experienced researcher who worked alongside activists and younger researchers. So there was a strong capacity building element to that work. But first, I just want to take you through what the People's Health Movement is, because I think we're primarily a large network of health activists, and we include academics, health professionals, community activists, some NGOs. We really take which is now a very old document, the Alma Ata document of the World Health Organization, but it really spells out in very clear terms an agenda for achieving health for all. And for instance, it calls for a new economic order. So it really looks at the kind of basic determinants of health. And the main things we organise is to combat the sort of economic and political causes of deepening health inequities, both in countries and worldwide, and to revitalise the implementation of comprehensive primary health care as the basis of health systems. We were formed in December 2000 when 1,500 activists from 90 countries convened the first People's Health Assembly in Bangladesh. It was an amazing event. We were fed by the local women, and we ate wonderful food every day from great big pots. And there was just such a vibe at that People's Health Assembly. And the People's Health Movement we'd worked with various country circles in the year leading up to the People's Health Assembly. So by the time we got there, we had a draft of the People's Charter for Health. And that was then further refined during the Assembly, and then finally was adopted. And we had a very positive vision. And I think if you read that, it's about equity, ecological sustainable development, and peace at the heart of our vision of a better society. A world in which a healthy life for all is a reality, a world that respects, appreciates, and celebrates all life and diversity, a world that enables the flowering of people's talents and abilities to enrich each other, a world in which people's voices guide the decisions that shape our lives. And I think that positive vision has really lasted well. If we think about the issues in the world today, I think they are captured in our vision. And the Charter really positioned health as a human right. So it was something that people were entitled to as part of being a human, and that governments had the responsibility to meet that. We also obviously focused on the underlying determinants for health, particularly economic challenges, a focus on neoliberalism, social and political challenges, environmental issues, and war, violence and conflict and natural disasters and how they affect health. And we also argued very strongly for a people-centered health sector. So the movement started with a very strong set of values. And I think, key points, and I think this is a really crucial point of our movement, that we're very clear on our ideology, and that it is about the fundamental human right to health. It is about the principles of universal comprehensive primary health care. So that's much more than just GPs. It's about having a health service that also thinks about the health of the community. But governments have this fundamental responsibility to ensure universal access to quality healthcare, education, and other social services. The partition of people is essential, and that health is primarily determined by the political, economic, social, and physical environments. So we start with that very clear ideological statement of what we're aiming for. Our most recent assembly was again in Bangladesh. This was the fourth People's Health Assembly. It happened 3 years ago now, and it really reinforced the original charter. We updated it with a statement from Bangladesh, but essentially those values were the same. We have global programs that I'll talk a little bit about: the Global Health Watch, the International People's Health University, Health for All campaigns, and what we call WHO Watch. The People's Health Movement is made up of country circles, so they work on local issues, and again, I'll give some examples later. We have a global secretariat that has been based in India, but in January we'll be moving to Colombia in Latin America. We've moved our global secretariat around the world since we were formed. It's been in Africa, in Egypt, South Africa, Egypt, Bangladesh, India, and now it will be based, and our new global coordinator is Roman Vega, and he will start in January. And we're governed by a global steering council, and I'm currently co-chair of that council. And we also have an advisory committee of our elders, people who are very active, have been very active in PHM and continue to be so. One of our important strategies is what we call a platform of resistance to the neoliberal dominance in health. That's a very important document where we build on research analysis and we watch other institutions. We see this Global Health Watch as a counter to the World Health Report from the WHO. It's widely read, widely used in curricula, and it's a very important part of that strategy of understanding why we have the position on health that we do. Capacity building is also very important, and we run the International People's Health University. We've had well over 1,000 participants worldwide. We have a roving faculty, which is about learning, sharing, and planning activities for health activists. People who apply to the People's Health Movement have to show that they are involved in some activism and that they intend to go back to their countries and do that. And it's a great networking amongst health activists, and particularly the young people around the world. So that's really important. Of course, COVID has challenged that, but we have managed to do online IPHU that are probably not as good as face-to-face, but we have kept it going through the period of COVID. And then another important thing we do is around global health governance, and we watch WHO, which we hope is sort of changing information flows and power relations that frame global health. So our watching includes a team, when we're not in COVID, going to Geneva to the World Health Organization headquarters, and while we are there, we'll critique the policies that are being presented to the World Health Assembly, which is held in May every year, and the Executive Board that's held in January. And we'll monitor and we'll analyze those policies. We'll put the analysis on a website, and we'll talk to the country reps. And for many low and middle income countries who don't have a strong health policy function within their bureaucracies, they very often will draw on PHM's analysis and find that very useful. And then we also share that analysis of the resolution so that there is an open platform in which we do that. We also have a Health for All campaign with a range of thematic groups, and these operate locally, nationally, and globally. One is about advancing equitable health through health services. One is about just global trade. Another is on nutrition and food systems. Environment and ecosystems that currently is putting a lot of emphasis on the health damage of extractive industries. We have a very active gender justice and health group, and then a war and conflict, occupation and forced migration group. And each of those groups have been really quite revitalized in the last 3 years and are really working very effectively. And then, of course, we have country circles, and this is just an example of PHM Oz, as we called it, and you can just see various pictures of the sort of actions we have there. And in India, which has by far the largest country circle, they engage in, just one example, these people's health tribunals, where they, for instance, put the state governments on trial to determine the ways in which they are denying people the right to health. And when they say mass participation in India, that really is mass participation. It's hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of people. And finally, we're very conscious about building a movement for health around activism, action, and mobilization. And I think we do go in for a lot of reflection about how we build a movement. And that's what I now want to talk about, some of those theories behind the sort of actions that we take. So we did have a 5-year multi-country study, which involved groups in Brazil, Colombia, the Congo, India, Italy, and South Africa. And those countries were all engaged in actions under the umbrellas of PHM, and they were involved in a process of critical reflection. We also, as part of that project, assessed those global activities, the People's Health Universities, the Global Health Watch and the WHO Watch. We conducted narrative interviews with 15 long-term activists, and Connie Mussolino, who's online, led our analysis of those interviews and the way that they linked to building and strengthening civil society. We also considered historical cases of civil society that had been involved in health and promoting health. Our methods were participatory action research. It's the only way we could really do this. We were aiming to understand, how does civil society work? What are its strategies for movement building, campaigning and advocacy, capacity building, knowledge generation, access and use, and engaging with governance structures. And our project really placed a premium on the subjectivity of the activists rather than the objectivity of the researchers. And we have written up the methodology in Critical Public Health, if anyone is interested in that. So I think it's useful to look at some of the epistemological and methodological challenges that we faced in doing that research. So the first thing was that we had to make meaning. We had to seek knowledge that would be useful to practice, because we were working with activists on the front line, and they were less interested in research and generally more interested in, well, how is this going to help my practice? So we always had to be very careful to align research and action together and not to compromise what they were doing as activists. We had to manage power relationships. Researchers coming into civil society, sometimes there can be a real mismatch of power between researchers who sort of have the institution of the university behind them and activists who don't have that kind of institutional power, and in many countries may face political repression. So, for instance, in the Philippines, we've noticed in the last years there's been much more political repression there, and in many countries around the world. We also really wanted to value embodied knowledges. So there we draw on Paulo Freire's work, which really looks at the whole process of conscientization, where people actually reflect on their situation and they think about how does that link to broader structural power bases, broader structural institutions that are oppressing people. And we also wanted to recognize that experiential knowledges are very important. The other thing about doing this research is that we called chaos and contingency. Social movement activism is very unpredictable and very uncontrollable. So as a researcher, you're not really sure what you're going to be researching because civil society may go off in a different direction. And I know that our research group in the Congo were faced with incredible violence and military action within their community. And so their work really wasn't able to progress as much as we'd hoped. And the other thing we also wanted to do, and we tried to be aware of, was that we needed to challenge our own preconceptions about what is civil society and how it works, and really encouraging that culture of questioning. And sometimes that's very difficult if you work in civil society, because so often you're on the back foot, you're in a powerless position, that you don't have much sort of space to do that reflection. And I think one thing that our project managed to do was to get people thinking about, well, you know, how might we do our research differently and how might the activism happen differently? And one of the things that I'll talk about, these 4 areas, are what we call the logics of activist practice. And this came out of our analysis of those various forms of data that I described earlier. The first one is about pathways to activism. So we asked about how do activists think of the process through which people are engaged, what gets them to stay with the movement, and how can you facilitate that kind of engagement, but also retain people. So you don't want people to come into the activism and then sort of drift away because it's not meeting their needs. We also thought that there's a lot of questions about agency, and we explored how activists conceive the realization of their individual and collective agency and how that sort of fitted with the practice. We also then looked at theories of change, how activists conceive the dynamics of change and the drivers of change, and thinking about what can they influence. And then finally, we thought about the importance of convergence. How do you get the coming together of different social movements that were reacting to common threats? And particularly, we saw that for much of that convergence, it was around the issues that came from the sort of dominant neoliberal globalization regime. So I guess those are the four things that I want to expand on. So the first one, in terms of pathways to activism, well, in terms of individual factors, it's not surprising that very often it starts with a grievance, that people are experiencing injustice, which may include violence, denial of their access to services, denial of their human rights, expropriation of their lands, and displacement. So a lot of grievances clearly are behind civil society. The idea of solidarity and idealism were very clear in our narratives. And if you think back to the vision that PHM had, that really sets a very positive vision. It's not just about what's wrong, but it's saying what could be. You know, summed up perhaps in, you know, another world is possible, but that was a very important part for people. Also, that idea of how do you raise consciousness in people? How do you convert that feeling of injustice to activism? And that's very often through working with people to make those links from their own individual situation to those kind of broader factors that are really oppressing them. Now, that might be around the fact that you can't get an appointment at a health service. Why is that? Well, it's because our country's begun to privatize. And you begin to look at the links that are driving people's individual experience in a much broader structural way. We also see that for many people, and I guess I would fall into that category, that it's an extension of a professional role, and that very often reflects strong ethical foundations that people have, very often a sense of professional dissatisfaction and perhaps even alienation from the established institutions of healthcare. So it may be a doctor who thinks, well, I keep seeing patients in this clinic, but I'm not really dealing with the social determinants of health. What can I do to make a difference there? And then, of course, there's the experience of activism engagement. And PHM activists had very often, if we looked at those narratives, experienced national liberation movements, for instance, in Nicaragua, South Africa against apartheid, Zimbabwe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that sort of experience of engagement, of being involved in a social movement, meant that many people came to PHM with that background. And we also recognise that movement strategies can create organisations which are welcoming and supportive and that do facilitate activist development. And inspirational leadership is very important there, I think, really valuing people and relationships, having informal learning, people learning activism by doing and mentoring. And the movement is not an NGO, it's mainly volunteers. And that was just one quote from one of our narratives. One of the activists said, well, there's a lot of what a fellow activist calls bongos, which are briefcase-only NGOs, and basically where you can feel quite out of sorts because people are working for an NGO that have got no activist background whatsoever. They are there because they can get an extremely good salary. So they're marketing the difference between a sort of professional NGO service delivery and a movement. The next area that we looked at is about agency and activism. And there we looked at the barriers to agency, and clearly that's a lack of resources, the fact that there's kind of these hegemonic narratives about the inevitability of neoliberal policies and how good market relations are, so it's hard to challenge that dominant narrative. In some situations, an increasing number around the world, there's violence and repression, and there's the kind of strength of patriarchy and class oppression can be a real barrier to people taking action. One thing that helps is inspiring practice. So, for instance, good models of comprehensive primary healthcare, both in South Africa and India, have really inspired people. And when people have a positive experience with the struggle, such as the treatment action campaign in South Africa, which won a big victory against Big Pharma to get antiretroviral drugs for people with HIV/AIDS. And then the way that global narratives can inspire local action. And I think we've seen that recently in India, where they've used global narratives on intellectual property right in its patent oppositions, particularly around COVID, both vaccines and drugs, and also their trade campaigns. again, in terms of agency and activism, the experience of policy engagement can realise a real sense of agency. So, for instance, when those people doing our WHO watch see the policy analysis being used by low and middle income countries, that's very encouraging for them. It makes them think, well, that was really worthwhile. And for instance, we ran one of our international people's health universities for progressive government in El Salvador that enabled government officials to go through that international people's health university alongside civil society. So again, that was a sort of endorsement of what they're doing. I've mentioned leadership before, but it was evident in all our case studies and all the narratives, the importance of key people who could be inspiring. And then, of course, new institutional forms that can be really important to enabling people and collectives to realise their agency. And I think if you think back to that picture of the community-based monitoring and holding healthcare professionals accountable to their communities, that's a very good example of that kind of new institutional form. Just one example here from someone said, well, I was working there in a medical centre of some progressive organisations with a group of progressive doctors called Doctors for the People, and they'd set up some medical centres in workers' neighbourhoods. That was my first encounter with trade union activism and with local activism with community activists. And that's how I got involved in health activism. So people usually start with something that inspires them or enables them to see maybe you could practice in a different way. So then moving on to our theories of change, and there's a real crucial balance, I think, that we have to run in PHM between working with the concerns of and with grassroots people, but not losing touch and looking at the global picture, and that is a real balance. The discourse of human rights is crucial, either formally endorsed, for instance, the right to health in the Indian constitution, or morally asserted. For instance, a lot of the indigenous groups in Latin America are now using the language of the rights of nature in their struggles against extractive industries. And then the issue of refusal and resistance. Communities are left with no alternative except to resist in some circumstances. And then I think of our colleagues in Palestine, even when it meant facing violence and repression. Or from our case studies, we saw that very clearly with indigenous peoples in Colombia, and actions for compensation for disabled former employees of a General Motors plant in Colombia, and certainly in terms of India and informal workers during COVID-19 who had to leave the cities, they're no longer employed, and walk back to their home communities. And it might be about new information flows. So if you look at this on the right-hand side, the People's National Health Insurance Campaign, the People's Health Movement raised a whole series of issues about the national health insurance that was being planned in South Africa, and were making the point that they wanted an equity system, a participatory system, a pro-public health system. And they were really encouraging everyone to mobilise and giving people much more information about what is the difference between the kind of national health insurance that PHM envisaged and one that the government was presenting. And then the importance of local people, I think you can see here. I think we always learn from the masses because they will always tell you what their needs are. You have to listen to them, analyse with them what is happening, and together you can come up with a course of action that will really lead towards a positive development. So that real assertion of working from people's lived experience. Then other theories of change was about building new alliances, and we certainly heard from Colombia, India and South Africa where networking was structured around specific projects, but they definitely had the aim of building a broader movement. Demands for state actions, especially to curb the adverse impacts of neoliberalism. So that's a really crucial part of activism, demanding that the state realise those rights to health. Also, delegitimization of established narratives. So those former disabled employees in Colombia organized demonstrations in front of the US Embassy and at the headquarters of the company in the USA. So they started to challenge the narratives that were being given by the company. Also institutional innovation. I've talked about IPHU, but also workers' health centers. And then the importance of self-reflection. And I guess the common thread there is that the personal is political, and that you can bring personal experience into focus while you're still looking at the wider political, economic and cultural contexts. And finally, of course, the macro principle, where you see a two-way communication between grassroots activist practice and global health advocacy. So this was one of our participants talking about why reflexive practice has been really important. She said it is a very highly relational activity, and talked to the importance of creating spaces within society which can strengthen interpersonal relationships, solidarity, reflection and learning. So creating that time, making the time to think about what you're doing. Again, another activist argued about the importance of Freire's ideas of encouraging continual and collaborative learning, which he says creates something new, which in turn could create change in society and then change the system. So always looking out from the individual to the system. And then someone saying, no, that balance isn't easy to maintain. And it can suck people into a long-term commitment, which often draws them away from their connection to work at the national and local level. And then the idea that you're looking at vested interests that are very deeply rooted, from bureaucracies to the politicians to the big corporations. So if you're working on food, market food prices are spiraling, so you need to look at the trade component of it, what the bilateral and regional trade agreements are doing. Working with the grassroots alone is not enough. So you can see how that's getting people to look at their local issue of food prices and looking out to the trade components. And then again, people saying that it's always going to be a struggle to be global. It's going to require greater sophistication and ability to integrate both in one's own thinking and strategies and in one's own actions. So then finally, another key strategy is convergence. And PHM is a network of networks as well as country circles. And for instance, Health Poverty Action in London, Viva Salud, a Belgian group, and Medico International, a German-based group. And PHM does work across geographic borders, issues and identities. And that kind of convergence practice involves us networking, it involves expressions of solidarity across our different streams of activism, developing and deepening personal relationships across those streams, having a dialogue of analysis and strategy, recognizing where we agree and working on areas of difference, and really deepening understanding and trust through collaboration. So we're very reflective about that. How can we make that convergence happen so that we increase the voices? And I think this quote from one activist about the concentration of power and economic power is continuing even 40 years after I started fighting against it. But when we think we have gone forward and made a small victory, the other side is making 2 victories. We have to basically keep up in this rat race. We organise and we have our meetings and we have our plans, but on the other side, they also do the same. They have the money and therefore are always one step above us. So that's really speaking directly to power and that civil society is usually on the back foot. So just in summary, I think civil society is vital to the achievement of health equity, but it does need to be supported and fostered. And especially in PHM, we've noticed increasing attacks on civil society activists since COVID. It's become really apparent that repressive governments are increasing around the world. And I guess the other myth is that the power of social movements comes from moral authority rather than an economic or institutional base. And that can be very powerful, but it can also be very diluted when you're in the face of that economic or institutional base. So thanks, and I hope we can have a good discussion now.
Brilliant, thanks, Fran. It really so lovely and so powerful to actually see inside a social movement, because often there's sort of just a language of, well, civil society is important. So it's really it's like seeing inside the sausage, isn't it? Of policy, but you're saying I need a different analogy. So colleagues, I hope you're thinking up questions or comments, either drop them into the chat or just sort of take yourself or put your hand up, because I'm split over 2 screens just so that I can perhaps see you. Whilst you're thinking, maybe Fran, can you sort of reflect on, so often can you get the pushback of saying, well, you're a researcher, you're an academic, you can't be an activist as well. You've got to have that, and you just do it so beautifully. You're just one of the world's best researchers, but you're incredibly involved in activism. So when the institution that is the academy says no, you can't do both of those, how do you reply to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it would go back to that quote from Marx, it's not just about understanding, it's about changing the world for the better. So I guess you appeal to the moral authority of, well, we actually want to make things more equitable, we actually want to make society healthier and more sustainable at the end of the day. So I think when you assert that moral position, then I think it's hard for people to argue against that. But on the other hand, some people still feel that the role of the academy is to analyse, to give information, but not to take a kind of moral stance on what action should happen. And I think that's a debate that, we really need to have within academia.
Yeah.
Because I suppose if you think of the situations where, I remember a few years ago at Flinders University, they were considering getting the Lomborg Centre, which was by the climate-denying Lomborg, who had been given a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry one way or another. And we protested against that. But I guess we were protesting against that because there wasn't research really to support the position of that person. If you looked at the evidence. So that in that case was not about cutting free speech. It was about saying this person doesn't seem to have the academic track record to be able to make these claims about the fossil fuel industry. But it is a difficult area, and probably your academic life is going to be easier if you're not an activist, I would say. I think I can see Julia enough on up there now. And Julia, you remember we were doing some research on Rio Tinto as a commercial determinant of health. No, it was the alcohol. Who was it who wrote, Julia? Was it the alcohol people? They actually, when they wrote back to us to say, no, you can't interview us because we think that you're biased and we won't cooperate, they actually copied in our Vice-Chancellor. So that was an exertion of big alcohol, against us, saying to the Vice-Chancellor, you've got these people doing this research that we don't agree with. So, it can be tricky at times.
Oh, brilliant. And I see Lucy, I'm not sure if you're there, Lucy Westerman, and I see you're online. I think much of what Fran has said, certainly your experience over the past number of years within the NCD Alliance, a very different, there's a global NGO in a sense, but trying to achieve some of the things that Fran was speaking about, that PHM was seeking to achieve. I just wondered if you had any reflections or could see some of the elements that Fran was speaking about. I'm putting you on the spot, and you may actually just be there online, but not. Awesome.
I am here. I'm here kind of on my lunch break. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and everything that Fran's talking about, we're in a really, I've just left the NCD Alliance, but in that role, you really get that strong need that civil society needs energy and resources to sort of step up and speak out. But there are challenges around trust in civil society itself, and sometimes you even find that sort of activists are fighting against each other, and that can be really challenging as well when you're sort of trying to. You're all actually on the same side, trying to achieve the same sort of battles around power imbalances and so on. So I think that can be a really big challenge as well. But yeah, I think everything that Fran is saying, I think bringing that global and local together is really useful sort of angle, and just, I guess making sure everyone's looped in together and trusting each other is important.
Thanks, Lucy. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
I was just going to say, Sharon, I think that point about trust is really important because, within PHM, we do have debates, about ideology or about how we should do things, and what's more important than another. And the trick is, creating that space where that can happen and ensuring people come out of it feeling valued whatever the outcome is. And that is a real struggle, you know, and I think it's particularly the struggle when you're a sort of civil society movement and you are always on the back foot in terms of power if you're arguing for social justice in a country that doesn't value that. And what always inspires me from so many of the people's health movement are that, you know, in a lot of countries, it's actually putting yourself on the line. I mean, I don't think that's the case for us in Australia yet, but I just think at the moment, for instance, one of our Global Steering Council members is a nurse called Shapa O'Day, who for over a decade has been running an NGO for women and children in the West Bank in Palestine. And about 6 months ago, the Israeli government just defined a whole lot of the NGOs as terrorist organizations. And she was arrested. So she's now in jail and being treated pretty badly. And we're running a campaign for her. But, you know, for her being an activist is something that meant she has actually put her life and liberty on the line. And you realize how many people are willing to do that. You know, they feel so enraged, or they have this grievance and they feel that they have to take this action despite it being a threat to them. And when we looked at our historical cases of civil society, they all involve people doing that, whether you're looking at the suffragettes, whether you're looking at apartheid. It does become, you know, power can be exerted against civil society in a very real and frightening way, I think.
Yeah. There's a question from Libby. Libby, do you want to, or is your bandwidth, are you having trouble with the bandwidth? I'll read out your question, but if you do want to come off mute, please do. How do you handle the need for making alliances with actors who have commercial conflicts of interest? How have you navigated that? It's been, I know, a real thing for you.
Yeah, I mean, we just wouldn't go into any alliance with a commercial interest. We just avoid that. I mean, we also, for instance, just recently we've been funded. Well, we have, it's very hard to get funding that isn't for a project when you're in civil society. And PHM, of course, does a lot of coordination, and we need some core funding for that. And we've got it from Open Society, which is George Soros's money. So, you know, there is some dilemma there that we have talked about, because that money was made from capitalism, you know, without a doubt. And similarly, at the moment, we're just getting funding from the Ford Foundation. So we've really dug into, obviously that came from originally from the car company, but we sort of dug into their current practices, and we've sort of had debates at our coordinating commission, should we accept that money or not? And we've really done some sort of due diligence on, are we compromising ourselves by doing that? And in that case, we've decided we haven't been. But I can't imagine us ever going into a coalition with a commercial entity.
Lovely. And Catherine Cullerton, I see you're online. Sorry, I'm putting people on the spot here. But Catherine, you've done that lovely work looking at conflicts of interest. So I don't mean in relation to PHM, but, you know, just for colleagues who are thinking about these alliances and building coalitions and partnership, any sort of reflection from your work around the conflict of interest?
Oh, I think it pays to take a risk-averse approach. I think you can't unwind. It's really hard to unwind a negative collaboration, and if nothing else, I think one of the most important things we have is our brand. You know, like that, how people see, external people see us and the organisations that we're advocating for, and if we weaken that through collaborating with a commercial organisation who is profiteering off our positive brand, you know, that it weakens you. And so I think people often think just very superficially at the financial gain, but I think it's really important to think through, you know, all of the potential implications of those sorts of relationships. Off the top of my head.
Yes, sorry about this. I'm just, thanks, Catherine. So I see there's a hand up from Leonard, and then there's a question in the chat. So Leonard.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating topic. So well done, and difficult to research, I think. So, yeah, kudos for doing that. I find myself nowadays sometimes defending the established order against some of my family members back in the Netherlands, for example, when it comes to COVID measures, who have a deep resentment or distrust of big pharma, therefore the vaccines, and the whole thing becomes, so I guess there's a lot of disenfranchised people, or people who feel disenfranchised, who find or trying to find a way out. And I would always hope that they would see sense and join movements like PHM and really tackle the determinants of what makes them happy, but not all of them go in that direction. So do you interact at all with people who choose nationalism or religion or some other system that appears to give a future that's better for them? Or do you rather not and try and strengthen the movement of the people who are at least somewhat susceptible? So I'm struggling a little bit as how to that dissatisfaction that often going into excruciatingly wrong directions. So I'd like to.
Yeah, no, Lynn, I think in PHM, religion isn't a forefront, but I know we have Buddhists, Muslim, Christian people, for instance, and maybe others. And certainly for some people, being active, they have a basis in their own faith that makes them feel. I think one of our respondents was now she's 99-year-old nun an American woman who's worked in the Brazilian Amazon forests for about 60, 70 years. And she's the most plucky activist you could imagine. And she has a very strong Christian base, and every time she writes to me, she'll bless me. And, I don't always feel comfortable with that as probably agnostic, but it means we are a broad mosque or church, if you think about it, in PHM. With the question of big pharma and vaccines, I guess our position is, of course, we accept the science on vaccines. I don't think you'd have an anti-vaxxer inside PHM. I can't imagine that. And actually, one of our big campaigns at the moment is equal access to COVID technologies, where particularly in South Africa, they've run a brilliant campaign, the PHM Circle there. But part of their strategy in that campaign has been to produce a whole lot of popular mechanisms, popular posters, and to talk in communities about, look, this is how vaccines work, this is what they do, giving people information and challenging anti-vaxxer information. So that's very important, and that falls under that need for new knowledge, so people get to understand that. And I think it's on our website, you can get access to those materials, and you can see how they've really tried to dig down and get at people's fears about vaccine, as well as arguing with big pharma that these should be freely accessible. And that, at the moment we know that about 2% of people in sub-Saharan Africa have had a double dose compared to how high it is and we're going on to our third dose. So, the inequities in that are they just show global health inequities writ so large. But part of that is talking to people about ideas that would challenge the value of vaccines. So it is really important. And I think, I suspect with a lot of Trump supporters, they're very angry people, and they're really reflecting the individualism which is so prevalent in American society. And I guess it's very hard to go about challenging that when it is such a dominant discourse.
Thank you.
Fran, there's a question from Gemma in the chat. So the power of inspirational leadership. So you've spoken about that being important. So how important, how essential, and how to foster that, if I'm summarising that properly, Gemma?
Yeah, no, that's good, Gemma. I think that is really important. And I think if you think of any social movement of any type, you can always point to inspirational leaders. Martin Luther King, the suffragettes. And in our movement, we've had, I think David Sanders was one of our inspirational leaders who died, and that caused a big shock in the movement. We thought, and I at the time was worried because we'd lost another of our leaders, Ahmet Sen, who just after that People's Health Assembly died in a drowning accident about 2 weeks after he'd been the main voice at that that assembly. But what's amazed me is how much the movement has moved on and used the inspiration of David and Amit and other leaders to go on and foster new leaders, and we've managed to do that. And I think you know, if a movement's entirely dependent on an inspirational leader, it can be a real problem. But if you try and foster as many inspirational leaders as possible, then that can work. So, you know, there are dangers of it all being about one person. And I must say, I did worry when we lost 2 of our leaders within just over a year. It really felt like we were very fragile. But in fact, we've proved to go from strength to strength since then. So I was very pleased about that.
Fran, do you want to just say a little bit about like how you fostered that? You spoke about I can't remember the word you used, but sort of the nurturing, the flourishing of people. Well,
I think in PHM, I think people who have been through those IPHUs keep popping up in other institutions such as WHO or the Gates Foundation even. And so one is that they're taking some of those values into other organisations and they're being leaders there, but they still remember they were inspired by PHM. Within the movement, I think we do that by always trying to have young voices, women's voices, as well as, you know, particularly when we started, there was quite a dominance of male leaders in PHM, but I think we've really changed that. And I think that's fostered in terms of people working on campaigns and taking on leadership positions, on getting the confidence. When the teams go to Geneva to work on the WHO Watch, they're working closely with older members of PHM who will be helping with the policy analysis, but it's very often a young team in Geneva who are really getting those skills of then networking with the particularly lower middle income country representatives on the World Health Assembly. So they're going up to introducing themselves, saying, look, we've done this analysis of that policy. So that's developing leadership skills. I think, you know, when people work on their country circles, they're developing those skills within the country circles. And it's always a struggle to keep that dynamic movement going. You know, I don't think it's easy. It's quite difficult. And for a number of years, we've had the aim of moving our global secretariat to Latin America, because, as I say, we've been in Asia, we've been in Africa, and we really want, because the People's Health Movement is very strong in Latin America, but much of the material is only in Spanish, and we try as much as possible to at least be bilingual, Spanish, English, but also other languages. And now we've achieved that, which is fantastic. And I think our new global coordinator, Roman Vega, interestingly, was an academic for most of his career. He'd also worked as a public servant, but he's now retired from academia and he wants to devote himself for the next probably 4 years to PHM, which is great because he, again, is an activist academic. And if you're involved in PHM, you'll hear much more about Roman in the coming years as he steps into that position of global coordinator.
Brilliant. Yeah, very positive. So one final question in the chat from Shanti, and it's a challenging question. So working with different ethnic and religious communities in different countries that are not your own, how does PHM avoid getting into conflicts that are real for one group and terrorism seen as real for one group and seen as terrorism by another?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess Palestine would be the perfect example of that. And I guess our analysis is that the people who need emancipating in Israel and Palestine are the Palestinian people. So we make a judgment based on the evidence. And it's interesting that there's quite a few of our members who are Jewish. And in that case, they are very much part of an international movement that they bring into PHM called Not in Our Name, which is an organization of Jewish people worldwide who are concerned about the Israeli government and its actions against Palestine. So that's an example where we network with that group, Not in Our Name. And as a group of Jewish people who are organized, you know, we'd listen to them. And we also have strong links with a range of Palestinian organizations. And for instance, one of our network group, Viva Salud, which is a Belgium NGO developed. They do lots of work in Palestine, so they would be one of our partners for making that decision. I guess, you know, I think generally we don't find it very hard to work out which groups we think are powerless. I guess what you're looking at is distribution of power, who has the power, who doesn't, and generally we'll be looking at people who are in the more powerless position. But and I can't think of any group where we've had people in one of our circles who have represented different groups. It's interesting. I never thought of that before, but I can't think of an instance where that comes up. But it may have come up in some country circles.
Lovely. Well, we are at time. We could stay talking for ages. Really, so interesting. And as I say, Fran, like, it's so helpful to have like all of that unpacked. I just don't think we get to hear or understand all of those aspects enough among sort of social movements. Really, really powerful. So, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. We have the final webinar in the series next Thursday, same time, same place. Dr. Patrick Harris from UNSW will be speaking, bringing us to a different level of governance, really getting local, but understanding that intersection with the bureaucracy, politics and power. So another super interesting webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks so much, Fran.
Yeah, thanks. Goodbye, everybody. See ya.